He had won. The reports arriving on the bridge of the Akagi were extraordinary. Battleship Row was in flames. The Arizona had exploded. The Oklahoma had capsized. The West Virginia, the California, the Nevada, sunk or burning. The American Pacific Fleet, the one force that could have blocked Japan's conquest of Southeast Asia, had been crippled in 90 minutes. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo had command of the most powerful carrier strike force ever assembled. 6 fleet carriers, 414 aircraft. He had launched 2 waves of attack, and both had succeeded beyond any reasonable projection. His aviation officer, Commander Minoru Genda, came to him now with a proposal. A 3rd wave. Hit the fuel storage tanks, hit the dry docks, hit the submarine pens. Without fuel, the surviving American ships couldn't move. Without dry docks, they couldn't be repaired. 1 more hour of strikes, and Pearl Harbor would cease to function as a naval base for months, possibly years. Nagumo said no. He turned the fleet northwest and sailed for home. That decision, made on the bridge of a Japanese carrier on the morning of December 7, 1941, is one of the most consequential military choices of the 20th century. Not because of what Nagumo destroyed, because of what he left standing. The 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil sitting in those storage tanks at Pearl Harbor powered the American Pacific Fleet for the next 3 years of war. If Nagumo had destroyed them, Admiral Chester Nimitz later said, the Pacific War would have been extended by 2 full years. But this episode is not about what Nagumo failed to do. It's about something deeper and more troubling. It's about the men who planned this attack, who spent years building the most sophisticated naval strike force in history, and what they actually knew about what would happen afterward. Because one of them had been saying for years that this attack would destroy Japan. Isoroku Yamamoto was 56 years old when he ordered the attack on Pearl Harbor. He had spent 2 years at Harvard. He had served as naval attaché in Washington. He had crossed the United States by train, visited its steel mills and oil fields, watched its factories and its roads and its people, and he had come home with a conclusion that made him deeply unwelcome in certain circles of the Imperial Japanese military. America could not be beaten in a prolonged war. I want to be precise about what Yamamoto actually believed and said, because this is an area where mythology has buried the historical record. The famous quote attributed to him, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve," almost certainly never happened. It appears in a 1970 film. It does not appear in any Japanese document, any diary, any letter from the period. Yamamoto did not say it. What he did say, in actual letters, in actual documents, is more specific and more damning. In a 1940 letter to a naval colleague, Yamamoto wrote that he was seriously concerned about a war with America. Japan could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. After that, he had utterly no confidence. These were not the words of a man who believed Pearl Harbor was a path to victory. They were the words of a man who believed Pearl Harbor was a gamble that would end in Japan's destruction, and who planned it anyway because he saw no alternative. To understand this, you need to understand what Japan was in 1941. Japan was an island nation with almost no natural resources. No oil, no iron ore, no rubber. Everything that kept its military running, everything that kept its navy at sea and its aircraft in the air, had to be imported. In 1941, 80% of Japan's oil came from the United States. In July 1941, after Japan moved forces into southern French Indochina, President Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in the United States and established a total embargo on oil exports to Japan. In a single executive order, America had started a clock ticking in Tokyo. Japan had approximately 18 months of fuel reserves. After that, the Navy stopped moving. The Army stopped fighting. The country stopped functioning. The Japanese military leadership faced a choice with no good options. Accept American demands, withdraw from China, abandon the conquests of a decade, surrender the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, or go to war while they still had fuel to fight. Yamamoto understood both options were catastrophic, but only one of them gave Japan a chance. This is the detail that the popular narrative almost always skips. Yamamoto did not plan Pearl Harbor because he thought Japan could win. He planned it because he thought Japan was going to lose either way, and at least this way, Japan might buy enough time to negotiate from a position of strength. The attack was not a bid for victory. It was a bid for a better peace settlement. That is the key to understanding everything that went wrong afterward. He drafted the plan in January 1941 and spent months fighting to get it approved. The Naval General Staff initially rejected it as too risky. Yamamoto threatened to resign if it was not implemented. They approved it in October. The man who had warned them all, who had written in letters that he had utterly no confidence, boarded the flagship Nagato on December 7th and waited for the reports. He was about to find out how badly he had misjudged one variable. A note before we continue. This is an educational history documentary. The events described are real. The language is specific because the subject demands it. The narration you hear is AI-generated using 11 labs. The script, research, and all editorial decisions are human-authored. Historical photographs and archival materials come from the U.S. National Archives, the Naval History and Heritage Command, the Library of Congress, and Wikimedia Commons. All sources are public domain and listed in full in the description below. If this story matters to you, please like and subscribe. It's the most direct way to make sure more stories like this one get told. Now, back to the story. The entire Japanese strategic plan rested on a single assumption. One calculation about human nature that, if wrong, made everything else irrelevant. The assumption was this: Americans were rational actors who would calculate costs. Japan's military leadership, with some exceptions, had studied America's political history and reached a conclusion that seemed reasonable. Americans had shown repeatedly that they preferred negotiation to conflict when the cost of conflict was high enough. American politics were fractured over foreign intervention. The America First movement was powerful. Isolationist sentiment was real. Pearl Harbor would present Americans with a brutal arithmetic: reconquer vast Pacific territories at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives, or accept Japan's position in Asia and move on. Rational people, the Japanese concluded, would choose accommodation. I've read the accounts of the imperial conferences in 1941 very carefully, and what strikes me is how little the Japanese leadership actually knew about the country they were attacking. Senior naval officers like Yamamoto and Nagano had spent time in America, but the army leadership, General Tojo, General Sugiyama, had not. Their mental model of the United States came largely from intelligence reports and from Japan's experience with China and Russia, enemies who, after sufficient punishment, had eventually accepted terms. They were mapping American political culture onto frameworks that didn't fit, and nobody in the room had enough authority or enough courage to tell them how wrong they were. There were voices of warning. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo had argued against war. Admiral Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, had asked at a council meeting what Japan's strategy was if America refused to negotiate. The question hung in the air, unanswered. But even the skeptics had not fully grasped the specific dynamic that a surprise attack on American soil would create. This is the variable Yamamoto had misjudged. Not American industrial capacity. He understood that perfectly. What he had underestimated was what a Sunday morning attack on a naval base in Hawaii would do to American domestic politics. The America First Committee, the most powerful isolationist organization in the country, dissolved itself 4 days after Pearl Harbor. The Senate vote authorizing war against Japan, 82-0. The House vote, 388-1. One vote against. Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, a committed pacifist who had also voted against entering the First World War. The rest of Congress, every Republican, every Democrat, every isolationist who had spent years arguing against involvement, voted for war. The calculation Japan had made, that American political division would limit the response, had been obliterated in a single morning. Pearl Harbor had not created space for negotiation. It had created a political consensus that would not break for 4 years. Yamamoto received the final vote tallies in his cabin aboard the Nagato. He did not sleep well that night. The history books give us Yamamoto the strategist, the man who invented carrier task force doctrine, the gambler who bet Japan's future on a single strike. I want to give you the other Yamamoto. He was a private man of startling contradictions. He loved shogi, Japanese chess, and played it obsessively. He loved poker and was, by accounts of American officers who played against him during his Washington assignment, genuinely difficult to beat. He corresponded with geisha. He was a married man who maintained long relationships with women who were not his wife. And he was open about this in a way that was unusual, even for the standards of the time. He wrote poetry. This detail always stops me. The man planning the most consequential naval attack in history was writing traditional Japanese poetry in his cabin at night. He wrote to Chiyoko Kawai, the geisha with whom he had the longest correspondence, throughout the months leading up to Pearl Harbor. The letters are not the letters of a confident wartime commander. They are the letters of a man who knows what is coming and cannot stop it. I find myself wondering what the world will be like after this, he wrote in one letter from late 1941. He was 57 years old. He had seen enough of the world to know exactly what was coming. He planned it anyway. The morning the attack reports arrived, Yamamoto was playing shogi. A staff officer brought the initial communiques. The strikes had succeeded. The battleships were burning. Yamamoto acknowledged the reports, moved a piece on the board, and continued the game. His flag secretary, Commander Yasuji Watanabe, later recalled that Yamamoto seemed subdued rather than triumphant. When the battle reports confirmed the success of both attack waves and Nagumo's decision to withdraw rather than launch a third strike, Yamamoto said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "The carriers escaped." Not, "We won." Not, "The plan succeeded." The carriers escaped. 3 American fleet carriers, the Enterprise, the Lexington, the Saratoga, had been at sea on December 7th, not at Pearl Harbor. The one class of ship that could have made Yamamoto's attack truly decisive had survived untouched. And Nagumo, unwilling to risk his own carriers searching for them in open ocean, had turned for home. I think this is the moment, this specific moment on the bridge of the Nagato, when Yamamoto understood how the war would end. Not in months, not in that year, eventually. The carriers had escaped. The fuel tanks had been left intact. The dry docks were undamaged. Pearl Harbor would be operational again within weeks. The blow he had struck was devastating, but not crippling. And he had spent his entire argument for the attack on the promise that it would be crippling enough to force negotiations. It hadn't been. And he had used up the one asset, surprise, that could never be recovered. He returned to the shogi game. His opponent could not remember who won. What followed Pearl Harbor was one of the most spectacular runs of military success in modern history. Japan's forces moved with a speed and precision that stunned Allied commanders who had spent years dismissing Japanese military capability. December 10, 1941. HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse were sunk by Japanese aircraft off Malaya. The British had believed their ships were safe from air attack in open water. They were wrong. December 25th, Hong Kong surrendered. The British garrison had held for 17 days. January 2nd, 1942, Manila fell. MacArthur's forces retreated to the Bataan Peninsula. February 15th, Singapore. Over 80,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops surrendered to a Japanese force of roughly 35,000. Churchill called it the worst disaster in British military history. March 9th. The Dutch East Indies, the oil fields Japan had gone to war to capture, fell. The entire strategic objective of the southern operation was achieved in 93 days. Every objective achieved, most ahead of schedule, often at lower cost than projected, and Washington offered no terms. This is the silence that should have told Japan's leadership everything. Not a single diplomatic overture from Washington, not a single back-channel inquiry, nothing. Roosevelt's rhetoric was hardening, not softening. He was speaking of total victory, of unconditional surrender. The word negotiate did not appear in any American official communication in these months. Not in private, not in public. At Imperial General Headquarters, the victories were celebrated, and the silence was explained away. The Americans needed time to process the scale of their defeats. Once the full cost of reconquest became clear, rational calculation would reassert itself. I want to be fair to the Japanese military leadership here, because the popular narrative treats their optimism as obvious stupidity. It wasn't. Their model had worked before. Russia, after the shock of losing Port Arthur and the annihilation of the Baltic Fleet at Tsushima in 1905, had negotiated. Germany, in 1918, had negotiated before its military was completely destroyed. Great powers had historically made cost-benefit calculations and chosen terms over continued destruction. Japan's mistake was not in applying this model. Their mistake was in not understanding that the specific nature of Pearl Harbor, a surprise attack on a Sunday morning, without a declaration of war, killing servicemen at anchor in their own harbor, had made cost-benefit analysis politically impossible in America. Pearl Harbor hadn't just started a war. It had made the conclusion of that war on any terms other than unconditional surrender politically unthinkable. There was one man in Tokyo who understood this with clarity. Shigenori Togo, the foreign minister who had opposed the war, watched the diplomatic silence from Washington with what he later described in his memoirs as mounting alarm. He had spent his career in diplomacy. He knew what silence from a great power meant. It meant the decision had already been made. There was nothing to negotiate. He was overruled. The victories continued, and Washington said nothing. By spring 1942, the strategic situation had produced a paradox that Japan's military leadership could not resolve. Every battle had been won. Every territorial objective had been achieved, and yet the war showed no sign of ending. American rhetoric was hardening. American shipyards were accelerating production. American carrier operations were becoming bolder. The Doolittle raid in April 1942 had put American bombers over Tokyo itself. Yamamoto proposed a solution. Draw out the American carriers and destroy them in a single decisive battle. Forced the naval confrontation that would make continued resistance impossible. He chose Midway Atoll as the bait. The operational plan for Midway was, by any objective measure, a masterpiece of complexity and a catastrophe of overconfidence. Yamamoto divided his forces across multiple task groups, spread across hundreds of miles of ocean. He assumed American ignorance of his intentions. He assumed American carriers would appear where and when he expected them. He assumed his four-carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, commanded again by Nagumo, would have time to neutralize Midway's land-based air power before the American carriers appeared. Every assumption was wrong. American codebreakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had broken the Japanese naval code sufficiently to identify the target, the date, and the approximate composition of the attacking force. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who had taken command of the Pacific Fleet after Pearl Harbor, knew Yamamoto was coming. I find the story of Station Hypo one of the most remarkable in the entire Pacific War, and it connects directly to Nagumo's decision not to launch the third strike on December 7th. If the fuel tanks and dry docks at Pearl Harbor had been destroyed, the code-breaking operation housed there would have been severely disrupted. The communications infrastructure, the records, the continuity of intelligence work, all of it depended on Pearl Harbor functioning as a base. Nagumo's caution at Pearl Harbor inadvertently preserved the very intelligence capability that would destroy his fleet at Midway. History's ironies are rarely this precise. June 4th, 1942. The Kido Butai launched its first strike against Midway. Nagumo's aircraft were on their second arming cycle, switching from torpedoes to bombs for a second strike against the island, when the report came. American carriers, 30 miles away. The hangar decks of the Japanese carriers were stacked with armed aircraft, fuel lines running, bombs and torpedoes on carts and trolleys. Nagumo had to choose: launch immediately with half-armed planes, or take 30 minutes to rearm and respot, striking with full force. He chose to wait. American torpedo bombers from the Enterprise, the Yorktown, and the Hornet flew into withering anti-aircraft fire and Zero fighters. Nearly all of them were shot down without scoring a hit. The sacrifice drew the Japanese fighter cover down to wave-top level. 37 American dive bombers arrived at altitude, unopposed. In 6 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were hit and fatally damaged. The Hiryu, the 4th carrier, survived long enough to cripple the Yorktown before American aircraft found and sank her that afternoon. 4 carriers, 348 aircraft, more than 3,000 experienced air crewmen and sailors, gone in a single day. Yamamoto received the news aboard the Yamato. He ordered all lights in his cabin extinguished and sat alone in the dark for an hour. When he emerged, he gave the order to withdraw. There would be no decisive surface engagement. There would be no chance to recover the situation. The battle was over, and with it, Japan's ability to choose when and where to fight. Midway is often described as the turning point of the Pacific War. That is accurate but incomplete. Midway was the moment the mask came off. The moment when even the most determined optimist in Imperial General Headquarters had to confront a truth they had been avoiding since December 8th. Japan had no path to victory. The question was no longer how to win. It was only how long to continue losing, and at what cost. In American shipyards, a new carrier was being completed every month. Japan had lost 4 in an afternoon. The question Admiral Nagano had asked, what is Japan's strategy if America refuses to negotiate, now presented itself with lethal clarity. There was no strategy. There never had been. This is the structural flaw at the center of Japanese strategic planning for the entire Pacific War, and I think it deserves more attention than it usually receives. Military organizations plan operations. They select objectives, allocate resources, establish timelines, measure success. Japan's military was extraordinarily good at all of this. What they could not do, what they were organizationally incapable of doing, was plan for an outcome they had decided not to consider. The outcome was, America doesn't negotiate. Nobody in Imperial General Headquarters had a plan for that contingency. Not because they were stupid, because acknowledging that contingency in a planning document would have required acknowledging that the war itself was a catastrophic error. And that was politically impossible. What emerged instead was a strategy by default. If Japan could not win, perhaps it could make winning so costly that America would tire of the effort. Every island would be a fortress. Every assault would be a bloodbath. At some point, the reasoning went, the American public would calculate the cost of the next island, and the next, and decide that some negotiated settlement was preferable to more. It was the original assumption. American rationality would lead to compromise, reborn in a more desperate form. Guadalcanal from August 1942 to February 1943 tested this theory. Japan fed men and ships into the Solomons campaign with extraordinary tenacity. 6 major naval battles, 3 months of ground combat in jungle that consumed men from disease as fast as combat. Japanese logistics failed. American logistics, using Pearl Harbor as its supply base, the same Pearl Harbor that Nagumo had left intact, proved inexhaustible. American losses at Guadalcanal were real and painful. They did not produce calls for negotiation. They produced calls for reinforcement. The dynamic Pearl Harbor had set in motion, that every American death strengthened rather than weakened the political consensus for total victory, operated with increasing force as the war continued. Every casualty was not a reason to stop. It was a debt that had to be repaid. Japan had created, through Pearl Harbor, a war that could only end one way. Foreign Minister Togo understood this. He watched the island campaigns with despair. By 1943, he was making tentative inquiries through neutral intermediaries, Sweden, Switzerland, about whether some face-saving formula might be found. The Americans said no each time. Unconditional surrender, nothing less. This had been Roosevelt's position since December 8, 1941. It never changed. In April 18, 1943, Yamamoto boarded a Mitsubishi G4M bomber at Rabaul for an inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomons. He had issued a detailed itinerary and an encoded signal to his subordinate commanders several days earlier. American codebreakers read it. 16 P-38 Lightning fighters from Guadalcanal flew a carefully calculated intercept mission, flying low over the ocean to avoid radar detection. At 9:34 in the morning, they found Yamamoto's 2 bombers and their 6 Zero escorts over the jungle of Bougainville. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. Yamamoto's aircraft was hit and crashed into the jungle. When a Japanese search party found the wreckage the next day, they discovered him still strapped in his seat, dead, his white-gloved hand gripping the hilt of his sword. I've read the accounts of Yamamoto's death many times, and I always return to the same detail: the white-gloved hand on the sword, the formal dress, the ceremony. Even in a jungle wreck, even in death, the performance of command. He had spent his career performing certainty he did not feel, planning with confidence the war he believed would destroy his country, projecting authority over decisions he knew were wrong. The white glove on the sword hilt is the image I carry from this story. It is the image of a man who did his duty and spent his life knowing that duty was a catastrophe. Japan announced his death to the public on May 21, 1943, more than a month after it happened, to prevent the shock from affecting morale. His ashes were returned to Japan on a warship and received with full state honors. He was the last Japanese commander the American codebreakers feared. In the final months of the war, Emperor Hirohito began asking the questions he had not asked in 1941. The historical record of Hirohito's role in the war remains one of the most contested areas of Pacific War scholarship, and I want to be honest about that. What strikes me about Hirohito's wartime role is not whether he was a war criminal or a prisoner of his military. That debate will continue. What strikes me is the moment, documented in the diary of his Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, Koichi Kido, when he began asking pointed questions about the strategic assessments he had been given in 1941. Why had the military assured him America would negotiate after initial defeats? Why had the planning assumed American rationality? Why had no one considered the alternative? These questions, asked in 1944 and 1945, are devastating. Not because they assign blame, but because they reveal what everyone in that room already knew. The plan had been built on an assumption that nobody had dared to challenge publicly, and the emperor had not challenged it either. By 1944, with American B-29 superfortresses beginning firebombing raids on Japanese cities, and American forces retaking the Philippines under MacArthur's command, the peace faction within the Japanese government was growing. Former Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe sent a memorial to Hirohito in February 1945, arguing that continued resistance served only to enable communist revolution in the chaos of defeat. The war minister and the army rejected negotiations. The fighting continued. On the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, American B-29s dropped incendiary bombs on Tokyo. The resulting firestorm killed an estimated 80,000 people and destroyed 16 square miles of the city. More people died in a single night than at Hiroshima. The army still refused to discuss surrender. Harry Truman had been president for 83 days when the recommendation came. The atomic bomb should be used against Japan without specific warning, targeting a city with military and industrial significance. Truman approved. August 6, 1945. Hiroshima. August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria with 1.6 million troops. August 9th, Nagasaki. The Supreme War Council convened an emergency session with the council deadlocked. 3 votes for continued resistance, 3 for surrender, and brought the matter to the emperor. Hirohito gave his decision. Japan would surrender. I've thought about this decision from many angles, and what I keep returning to is not the atomic bomb or the Soviet invasion, though both were decisive, but a simpler question. What did Hirohito and the surviving members of the Supreme War Council actually believe in those final days about what the war had been for? The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was gone. The Navy was on the ocean floor. The cities were ash. The dream of forcing a negotiated settlement had died at Pearl Harbor before the first wave landed. 4 years of war, 3 million Japanese dead, and not one of the objectives the attack was supposed to achieve had been achieved. I don't know how a man sits in a room with that reality and finds language for it. The emperor did. He said, "I cannot endure the thought of letting my people suffer any longer." Whether that was truth or performance or some combination that defies easy categorization, I leave to the historians. On August 15, 1945, for the first time in history, the Emperor of Japan spoke directly to the Japanese people on radio. In a recorded address that survivors describe as nearly incomprehensible, read in formal court Japanese that most of his subjects had never heard before, Hirohito announced the end of the war. He did not say, "surrender." He said Japan would endure the unendurable. In the streets outside, people wept. Some could not understand the formal language and had to be told by neighbors what had happened. Some who understood fell to their knees. Some simply sat down on the pavement where they were. The war Japan had started to secure a better peace settlement had ended in the most complete possible defeat. The surrender ceremony was held on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Japanese Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, who had lost his leg in an assassination attempt in 1932, limped across the deck with a cane and signed the document. Among the American officers observing the ceremony was Admiral Chester Nimitz. In the harbor behind the Missouri were hundreds of American warships, carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers. Most of them had been built after Pearl Harbor. Here is the thing I find most haunting about this entire story. It is not Nagumo's decision on the bridge of the Akagi. It is not Yamamoto's white-gloved hand on the sword. It is a closed room in Tokyo in the autumn of 1941. In that room, senior Japanese military and civilian leaders had access to all the same information we have been discussing. They knew American industrial capacity. They knew American oil production. They knew the American population. They knew that Yamamoto had written in a letter that he had utterly no confidence in a prolonged war. They knew that Nagano had asked, and nobody had answered, what the strategy was if America refused to negotiate. They knew all of it, and they voted to proceed. The mechanism by which this happened, how a room full of informed people makes a decision that all of them, in some part, know is wrong, is not unique to Imperial Japan in 1941. It is one of the oldest failures in the history of human organization. The information exists. The warning is on record. But speaking the warning clearly, in the room where the decision is made, means opposing the momentum of an institution, the will of the military, the force of national prestige. So people adjust their language. They say, "I am concerned," instead of, "This will destroy us." They say, "I have reservations," instead of, "We are making a catastrophic error." And the decision carries. Yamamoto did not say at any imperial conference, "This attack will destroy Japan." He said in a letter, after the decision was made, that he would follow the emperor's wishes. He planned the attack with extraordinary care and skill. He executed it as well as any operation in history has been executed. And he did all of this while knowing, as his letters confirm, that the war it started would end with Japan's destruction. The sleeping giant, quote, is fiction. The sleeping giant, however, the American industrial capacity, the American political consensus, the American willingness to fight across 4,000 miles of ocean for 4 years, was very real. Yamamoto knew it was real. The closed room voted anyway. That is not a story about Japan in 1941. That is a story about rooms and decisions and the price of not saying what you know to be true. Thank you for watching. If this is the kind of history you're looking for, subscribe. There's always another story waiting. The next documentary starts right after this one.